To Kill a Mockingbird, essay questions and essay plans. And this one is focused on courage. The questions about courage are often quite easy to answer, as the examples from the novel are very clear, but you're not likely to get an exceptional mark for this. If you're aiming to sort of get a pass or a little bit above it, maybe 40, 50, 60%, courage is probably the one you want to be aiming for, as it's quite easy and quite clear. There's not a lot of divergence or your own thinking you could put into it, as the scenes are pretty clear cut and there's not a lot of interpretation needed. So in 2015, the question they developed was courage is more than a man with a gun, which is clearly pointed towards the shooting of the dog scene. And in 2016, the question is, how do Harper Lee's characters in To Kill a Mockingbird discover what it truly means to have courage? Which broadens it out and it provides a lot more options to discuss other things. But even still, the options are quite limited, as courage is only exhibited in a small number of scenes and concepts throughout the book. And this is just another way that people have decided that you could approach the question of courage. Alright, question 1. In Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, courage is more than a man with a gun. Discuss. So, the obvious possible plans here are Mr. Bose, Atticus, and Tom Robinson. So the example of a man with a gun is Atticus, but you could also talk about other scenes in him shooting the dog where he shows courage, such as taking the case, defending Tom out the front of the jailhouse when the lynch mob arrive, and so on. The second question, in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, how do Harper Lee's characters discover what it truly means to have courage? So as well as the previous 3, which also fit for this question, you could maybe talk about Scout, Dolphus Raymond, Calpurnia, and though it's not listed here, you could talk about Boo Radley and the fact that he left his home to protect Scout from being murdered. The evidence to use, obviously Mr. Bose dies free from morphine, with a little bit of help from Scout reading to her and Jem also being present to distract her. She manages to kick the habit and die free of drugs on her own terms. The obvious example throughout is Atticus shooting the dog, which is where his children learn that he is quite, or at least was quite athletic as a youngster. A more complicated version of courage is Tom running away from jail. So he's quite confident that the court system won't protect him and that it won't find him not guilty. Though Atticus is sure a retrial would be a high possibility, Tom decides quite courageously that it's quicker to get it over and done with than live a life hoping for something that probably won't happen. So he tries to escape, climb over the jailhouse fence, and he's shot 17 times as a result. A more obvious example, Atticus accepting the case, is clearly courageous, though as Atticus says that he had to, it is after all his job, whilst the town people believe that the fact that he actually aims to prepare a case and defend Tom properly is the problem in itself. So a less courageous approach would be for Atticus to accept the case, but to do a bit of a half-assed job and not really worry too much about it. However, he puts a lot of effort into it, and as such he's able to produce quite a strong case against Bob and in defence of Tom. A more traditional example is when Atticus is brave in the face of threats on his life and his family's from Bob Ewell. So there's a small little peppered examples throughout the book where Bob will approach Atticus and he'll say, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to kill your family, and Atticus stoically remains nonplussed by this. A key scene is when Atticus, Scout and Mr. Underwood camp out the front of the jailhouse when the lynch mob arrives to hang Tom. Mr. Underwood is quite a tricky character in the sense that he's up in the window, he doesn't reveal himself at all until the mob has already left and Atticus and Scout have sort of diffused the situation. But he does say, to Atticus, I've had you covered the whole time, and he's up there with a shotgun. So depending on what you think, is that courageous or not, you decide. The one I mentioned earlier, Boo, when he leaves his house to defend Scout from Bob Ewell trying to kill her, that's very brave. It's towards part 1 of the book, it mentions that he hasn't left home since the incident, so he's probably been locked up in his house for 10 to 15 years. Dolphus Raymond marrying an African American woman. So this is a very subtle one that you could also talk about in the racism question or theme. Dolphus Raymond pretends to be an alcoholic. He carries around a brown paper bag with a bottle of Coca-Cola in it to give the impression that he's a heavy drinker and therefore a little bit crazy, and that puts him above the ire of Maycomb, and the town doesn't really worry about his actions because of that, and that's how they can explain away the fact that he's married an African American woman. But really, he's not a drunk, he's not crazy, he just does what he thinks is right rather than what the town or the mob mentality of Maycomb decides. And the last example of courage is Calpurnia taking Scout and Jem to her first purchased church. You can see she's really are probably a little bit nervous about it, in that she dresses up Scout and Jem perfectly, so no one can say anything about her mothering skills or her babysitting skills, depending on how you want to paint her in this picture. And she does get some backlash from Lula when she arrives. So that's a small example of courage. In terms of quotes, you could use this one of when Atticus is speaking about Mr. Bose. She was going to leave this world beholden to nothing and nobody. So that's him explaining to the children the way that that's an act of courage. Yeah, but Atticus aims to defend him. That's what I don't like about it. Which, as I mentioned earlier, is the way that Atticus has shown courage is by actually applying himself to the case and doing his best. Whereas the town would rather him not truly defend him, but simply be there in name rather than in mind. Instead of getting the idea that courage is more than a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and you see it through no matter what. So this Atticus ranting about courage and what it is, rather than shooting a gun or shooting a bird or shooting a dog. It's persisting when things get tough. And this is what Scout eventually will learn to do through part 1 of the book, overcoming what we would call bullying nowadays and the harsh words of her peers. It was times like these when I thought Atticus was the bravest man that ever lived. So this is Scout finally coming to see, just as Jem does himself, that Atticus is brave, and it doesn't take wild acts of courage to prove it, but it's about stoically going about what you need to be doing and doing it in a proper and correct way. So right at the end of the novel, when Scout's speaking about Boo with Atticus, it said he'd never have met you face to face, which shows that she's starting to get an empathetic idea of exactly how he lives his life and why he would never have come out and spoken to her face to face. In the same way that we might think of him as having an autism spectrum disorder nowadays, she's at least starting to grasp that he doesn't like to come outside. It's not that there's something weird or wrong with him, it's just how he prefers to live his life, and she's starting to understand that here. Right at the start, we see another one of these important Mockingbird type ideas. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. So this is Atticus mentioning this, and the earlier quote is her fully realizing this in its true sense, rather than just as a epitaph that Atticus tells her over and over again. She's actually understood it herself. I want you to see what real courage is, instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. And again, this is the same quote but shortened. It's probably more easy to put in an essay, but especially if that is your question, you'll want to be using this quote over and over again if the question was, how do they learn that courage is more than a man with a gun in his hand? And earlier in part 1, the quote is, you just hold your head high and keep those fists down. No matter what anybody says to you, don't you let them get your goat. Try fighting with your head for a change. So this Atticus showing that you can be courageous while having a stiff upper lip, biting your tongue, holding your fists down. That's still a sign of strength. Perhaps even a stronger sign of courage than having a fight with someone or sticking up for yourself violently. Good luck using these in an essay.